Right, yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm not James's brother. At one point in our team, we had 3 Wilsons, none of us related. Anyway, sorry. Right, I'm not very fond of talks that you could describe as some reflections on a subject, but unfortunately, when I wrote this, I realised when I'd finished that that's exactly what this is. It's a bit of a grab bag of things that we have learnt helping researchers with various issues around research data, collaboration and openness. And who are we? Well, I work at the moment within academic IT, research support, which is part of IT services, so the people who make sure that the mail arrives and so on. But we are a more specialist team within that who help researchers with various issues. We support them basically by providing a single point of contact for advice, support and guidance on a lot of different issues, but kind of I'll try and stick to the ones that are relevant for this subject for today. This list of things that we do may seem rather eclectic. It's born out of the fact that the staff who were there came out of various different externally funded projects over the years. So we can provide support on things like interactive and static data visualization in 2D and 3D, open data, open source software, both using it and licensing it out, community development around open projects, intellectual property rights and IT, digital humanities, text encoding, handling sensitive data, and selection of tools for your research. And we also teach on these subjects in the IT Learning Centre, which is another part of IT services. We can provide practical expertise for research projects. So often we get asked to do things like writing the technical plan within bids. Quite a lot of us in the past have been involved with assessing bids for funding within funders. So we have a decentish experience of the kind of things people want to hear in those sorts of sections of bids. But we also can be contracted to deliver IT-related work packages within projects, but for money. But otherwise, we are free at the point of contact, at least for initial consultation for Oxford academics. We produce web resources designed to support best practice around the university. So once we've had a question a certain number of times, we'll try and distill it into something which is more generally applicable, ideally something reasonably pithy and direct rather than discursive and hand-wavy. And we also work with other parts of the university. So, I mean, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the way that Oxford is, but it's a very, very disparate, loosely linked organisation. So as well as there being central IT provision, which is where I work, you have local IT support staff in departments and colleges who often don't know that we exist and we don't know they exist. And there's a great deal of disconnection, unfortunately, within Oxford from that point of view. We work with research services, which is another part of admin, which is responsible really for overlooking research bids and not overlooking them in the sense of ignoring them, looking over them in order to work out whether they're worth doing for the university, basically. And so some of our queries come from them. CUREC, which is the Central University Research Ethics Committee, and InfoSec, which is the kind of part of admin which is responsible for making sure that we don't get the Information Commissioner coming and fining us huge amounts of money. We also work alongside the libraries and Aura Data, which is the Oxford University Research Archive. That has existed for a long time. More recently, it's developed this offshoot which will take data sets really in response to funders insisting that data sets be available for projects that they fund, EPSRC particularly. And along with staff from the libraries and from Aura Data, we run a ticket system where people can email. You can email research data at oxacuc, and one of us will try and pick up your query. And if all this sounds like a pitch, it's because it is. Part of what I'm saying about the university being loosely connected means that it's often difficult to get your message across to everyone. And so at an event like this, where there's going to be a fair few Oxford academics, I thought I would do this transparent attempt to advertise our services. But it also gives you an idea of where we're coming from and what experience we have, I guess. So having said all of that, what do people ask us, particularly in this area that we're discussing today of sharing of data, particularly across national borders and so on? Well, we get quite often asked about who owns the research data. I mean, well, generally speaking, researchers assume they own their research data, and we'll talk a bit more about whether that's true or not in a slide or two. But we get asked questions about that a lot, particularly when people are being asked to provide licenses to their data in order for collaboration to take place. We also get questions about people wanting to adapt and reuse data that came from outside Oxford. What can they do? Is it allowed, etc.? What should they be looking at? Increasingly, we've had questions about managing and conveying sensitive data and how to manage projects in which sensitive data possibly sits between institutions and needs to be collaborated on from distinct entry points, potentially in different countries. We get asked a lot about, in connection with that really, cloud tools for collaboration, whether they're allowed to use them. People generally feel that they're awful and appalling and mustn't be touched because, I think partly because of the whole Edward Snowden thing, people feel a bit dodgy about the use of cloud tools, but we try and advise people as non-hysterically as possible on the benefits of using them, and indeed the potential downfalls. And yeah, we can help with questions on, as I said before, I think, technical sections on bid applications, usually relating to those 4 points, at least in terms of what we're talking about today. So on that first point about whether, what is necessary in order to share your data, who has to license the data if you're an Oxford academic, you have to read the statutes on intellectual property, 16 Part B of the statutes, if you're a fan of the Oxford statutes. It's a very, actually, sorry, who here has read the Oxford Intellectual Property Statutes? Yeah, I know you have. Okay, right on you. They're not easy to parse, I would argue. They remind me often of this. I don't know if you're familiar with this from Borges. This is a Taxonomy of Animals. Those that belong to the emperor, embalmed ones, those that are trained, suckling pigs, mermaids, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those that are included in this classification, those that anyway, you get the point. The intellectual property statutes take the form of saying Oxford claims everything unless it's created by these people or is of this kind. But then if it is of this kind, then perhaps we do claim it if it's one of these types of things. Meaning that you end up with a kind of a series of intersecting sets which are difficult to parse. And I believe, personally, that that's deliberate, that there is and actually, to be honest with you, it's not just Oxford. If you look at a lot of intellectual property policies of universities, they generally nudge you towards asking somebody. It's probably not strategically good for an academic to be able to read them and then, having read them, say, well, I am completely clear that I don't need to ask anyone before I do something. So I believe that is strategic. But the short version is that in terms of what Oxford claims of the outputs from the work of Oxford academics, Oxford permission is likely to be necessary for the sharing of research data generated at the university. There is a reticence both to say this and accept it. The university doesn't like ramming that fact down people's throats because it thinks it will annoy researchers. And of course, the university doesn't have any particular interest in depriving you of your research data or preventing you sharing it. It's just that in order to cross the T's and dot the I's and do the thing correctly, university permission is probably going to be necessary. Within the university, departmental heads and administrators can sign on behalf of Oxford, so they can sign up to agreements and dispose of intellectual property and license it on behalf of the university. They're thought by the Central University to be the people who are best placed to assess whether it's a good idea or not. If you go to Research Services or to Oxford Innovation, which is the university's technology transfer company, it used to be called ISIS Innovation, but for some reason they decided to change that. They have a non-general, short, academic use only license that they'll provide you with. So basically they'll say, okay, so what you want to do is collaborate with this particular individual, this particular researcher outside the university. Okay, here is a license which names them as the receiver of these rights and provides that they can use this stuff only for academic use, not for commercial purposes. And the reason they do that is that they don't want to get people involved in long negotiations. It basically does the job for what most people want to do. And it reserves the right potentially, or it doesn't queer the pitch potentially for commercial exploitation down the line. There are university spin-outs, successful university spin-outs from Oxford that are essentially based on data sets. So it's something that they don't really want to have no oversight of whatsoever. And I should say, ask any questions as I go along if you have any. But academics often go and share their data and reuse that of others without any knowledge of these issues, and we acknowledge that. And again, harping back on about the loose-knit nature of the university, it's often not really possible to detect that they're doing it, and people never know. So having said all of that, and maybe painted a bit of a picture of the way that the university is, what kind of queries do we generally get? We've had a couple of queries recently, actually, about the large-scale aggregation and publication of tabular data, so essentially scraping data sets out of historic academic papers and using that combined data set as the basis for another publication and potentially then sharing that data set. To what extent is that possible? Are permissions needed? Is it going to be, is the common conduct of academic practice that allows you to do that kind of thing, is that enough, or do you need to worry about intellectual property rights around that kind of thing? That's a query that's come up, unfortunately, relatively recently, multiple times. People often ask about the terms and conditions of cloud services as well, and the university had a working group on this for a long time, which eventually delivered a kind of kit, which was a here's where you should panic and here where you shouldn't, sort of a series of general guidelines. I'm not sure how useful it was actually, and in fact I think that's borne out by the fact that there is now another cloud working group, I believe, being formed. But the issue that people have generally with these terms and conditions when they're trying to decide whether to share or collaborate with their data using them is that the terms and conditions that you sign up to when you agree to use the services differ by territory. So if you have collaborators who are in another country, potentially they're signing up to differing terms and conditions for use of these cloud services than you are. And also nearly all of them, and this is true with any of these kind of asymmetric relationships between small researchers and large organisations, say that they reserve the right to alter the terms and conditions at their liberty for whatever reason at any point in the future, which means that if you're attempting to assess whether these things meet your responsibilities for data protection and so on, it may be true that they do today, it may also be true that they don't tomorrow, and you can't, unless as part of your research project you want to monitor the terms and conditions of your cloud provider, which I guess most people don't, that can be a problem. Another issue which I must admit actually, this doesn't come up with us directly, it's something I'm aware of and I thought I would throw in. If you have industrial, oh yes please.
Specifically about cloud services, does your department take a specific view if asked by a particular research project whether a particular cloud service like Dropbox or SharePoint is appropriate for that project?
We'll certainly read the terms and conditions and give you, but I mean, really what it amounts to is that the university is, I think, perennially about 2/3 of the way through a project to form a deal with one of these people or to negotiate special terms with them. I mean, it's always, and it will happen eventually, but at the moment it isn't quite there, which means that, and this will be a theme as we go through this talk, that we are in the business of providing short-term practical solutions to people's problems now, not providing a kind of grand sweep, this is the university's policy forevermore kind of. So yeah, we will provide practical help, we will read terms and conditions, we'll advise you on whether they meet your funders' requirements and the university's requirements. And we'll try and point you in the direction of other people who can perhaps serve you better, people who talk about data protection within the central university, for example. I think, kind of preempting my last slide, that's really the point of this talk, that policy frameworks are always changing, terms and conditions are always changing, and it's very tempting to just say, well, let's wait and see. Maybe eventually we'll come with a grand unified solution that will solve everything. But in practice, people need solutions now, and we have to give potentially not perfect solutions, but workable solutions when asked, usually days before people apply for the money.
So the implication of all of that is that you can't be sure about anything apart from what you can control. So why don't you just do everything internally?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, so, speaking as somebody who works for the internal IT services, it's very tempting to say you should spend all your money with us and we'll buy servers and then we'll get armed guards and we'll do anything. But the fact is that in practice, we aren't going to be the best people to do a lot of this stuff. And I say that kind of with somebody who has an inherent interest in saying that we are the best people to do it. So yes, it is tempting, but in practice, no one who has control of budgets is going to believe that in perpetuity. They're eventually going to say, you know what, it's a lot cheaper to do these things externally. What additional risks are we taking if we decide to do it? That's a process that's happening already and quite reasonably.
Surely within the UK there's a UCISA and lots of other organisations where you can cooperate and have a shared facility.
So the JISC has a shared data centre for that. But yeah, absolutely. No, indeed. Again, though, I suppose people, and this isn't to criticise the academics who come to us, but often people need solutions in a very short time period. And it's in terms of data curation, we'll point people to the DCC, the UK Data Archive. There are communally funded resources out there who can advise people, at least as well as us, better than us in many occasions, and also can provide services that aren't centrally funded within Oxford. We do point outwards to these shared resources where they exist. However, if anything I say today makes you think, why aren't they pointing them to this third-party service outside, just say so. Because another theme I want to bring out is that we don't know everything, and that most of the time we spend our time evolving new solutions for the reasons that I've given, that things change so often. Anyway, sorry, did that answer you? Cool. Primary purpose charitable research. So the university is an exempt charity, and we, in theory, should have two rates for having industrial collaborators, one of which is for research which serves our primary purpose as doing teaching and research and furthering the boundaries of human knowledge, and another one of which is a commercial rate, which is essentially, to put money in the coffers in order to further our charitable aims. The difficulty is that when you have industrial collaborators, they often want to negotiate access to your data, exclusive access to your data, or limit your own access or ability to use your data for further research. So that is an issue, particularly when you're in a subject area where people are willing to pay to have exclusive access to your data, and probably, therefore, I hope, vaguely relevant to what we're talking about today. And then we have the effect of Brexit. Lots of complication has come. I mean, and I'm not stating a position on Brexit either way, but it is certainly the case that things like database rights are difficult to understand, and data protection involves a great deal of overhead in order to implement. And also, I mean, we have, I'll go a bit more into this in the next slide, the EU text and data mining exception, which they're currently negotiating, is going to be much broader than the one that we brought in as a result of the Hargreaves review. So I'm not sure, are you aware of back in 2014, we got an exception to UK copyright law that allowed people to do a bit more in terms of text and data mining than we used to be able to do. This was in response to the head of Google, coming and giving a speech with David Cameron in the room and saying, if we wanted to start Google in this country, then we absolutely couldn't because of the way that your copyright law is framed. We have fair use in the US. You have these fair dealing exceptions in the UK, and they're rubbish, basically, was his point. So they went through a big review. The result was that we ended up with our exception, which allows text and data mining for non-commercial research, which is a bit rubbish, frankly. It's very difficult to know what constitutes non-commercial research. Arguably, we're a charity, therefore nothing we do is commercial, but that generally doesn't wash as an argument, unfortunately. At the moment, the EU, possibly as a kind of tantalising, look what we're doing now, you've left thing, are negotiating to have a much better, really brilliant text and data mining exception. Still not as good as fair use in the US, unfortunately, but it would require member states to provide mandatory exceptions for text and data mining carried out by research organisations for the purposes of scientific research. And this is a lot broader and potentially covers commercial research as well. And would, I guess, basically apply to the kind of work. But I hope you can see what I'm getting at here. If you end up collaborating with partners within the EU, they have this better exception, we have our more narrow exception. That can produce problems because what we are legally allowed to do with what is probably going to be a shared data set is going to be different here than there. And getting them to do the processing for you and only accepting the results is unlikely to be acceptable. It's going to be seen as deliberate avoidance, I think, of your responsibilities. But again, who knows how this will play out? Maybe we'll, who knows? So, yes, I think I've said all of that now, yes. As we talk to people around the university, it's very clear that there are very differing levels of maturity, particularly in this subject of sharing sensitive data. I mean, within medical science, this is something that they have to do all the time. They're very clear on how to anonymize data, what kind of restrictions they need to put in place, technological restrictions to the access to data and so on. Other areas of the university, other departments require more help and require us to help them more develop technological solutions for themselves. Nearly everyone understands the problem, but again, this goes to the point that I made to the gentleman there. There's little consensus about what constitutes a single brilliant solution to this particular problem, so that's why we're constantly evolving our view on what one should be doing. And again, this collaboration on live data sets is one of the more current live issues. Yeah, filing cabinets and audio tapes. So people tend to believe that a good approach to data safety, particularly if you're out in the field, is to make sure that your laptop is locked in your hotel safe the entire time, rather than thinking about encryption. We tend to focus more on encryption. The university, as a result of various, well, I won't say what it was a result of, actually, it's probably unwise, but the university has a very strong policy on making sure that laptops have whole disk encryption, and that therefore, if they're lost and they have research data on, they're not going to be of any use to anyone. That in itself potentially has an issue, although it hasn't come up yet, but I'll mention that on a later slide. But that, we try and steer people in that direction rather than the idea that physical access to your data is really what you should be concerned about. Already mentioned that there's going to be another cloud services working group. This is the issue I was going to mention. So when you send people out with whole disk encrypted laptops to certain parts of the world, you're actually, as far as I can see, and I'm not a lawyer, importing tools for strong encryption. Certain countries that isn't legal. So there's a difficulty there essentially in that we require academics, if they have laptops issued by the university, to have strong encryption on them. And yet, if you go to Russia, for example, it's not actually legal to have that. No, of course, it's very unlikely you're going to be caught, but that's an issue that possibly needs unteasing further down the line, and I hope has some relevance to what we're talking about today. And yeah, I put in the electronic lab notebooks because Howard asked me to. I'm not sure what relevant it is. It's something that we're doing at the moment, basically. The university asked to look into whether we should have electronic lab notebooks. Obviously, it's about the gathering of data and potentially the sharing of data, but it's really just in there because Howard asked me to put it in there. So, but if anyone in the room is an Oxford academic who has a view on electronic lab notebooks, Howard, put your hand up. You can talk to him. And we're having an event on sensitive data at IT Services in Banbury Road on the 19th. I would have given you a link to it, but we're currently going through a change of systems for booking things for IT, and therefore it's not possible to do that, unfortunately. But you can. So summing up, yeah, I think I've already said some of this stuff. Discussion of best practice tends to lead to these maudlin reflections on the multiplicity of issues, which is kind of what I've fallen victim to doing today, I guess. And tends to be my personality, to be honest with you. But Howard, who I've already name-checked and introduced here, is a much more positive, bouncy person and said to me, don't just go up there and say, oh, there are all these difficulties. So I'm being positive against my better judgment and saying that what academics want is brief, definitive advice on what technology they should use right now. And that really is essentially what we should be delivering. I agree with that. And it is, in the end, regardless of how maudlin you are about the difficulties, what you have to deliver. And yeah, the challenge for teams like ours is to deliver it without equivocation or hedging. Thank you. So yes,